can turn their camera off, and Jonathan will stop recording once he's finished giving the talk, and the chat will not be recorded. So we're currently recording now. Jonathan, take it away.
Yeah, brilliant. So thanks for attending, everyone. I'm going to be sharing my screen at a few points, and yeah, just recording the screen so people will be able to see it afterwards. So today I'm going to be discussing academic publishing from a humanities perspective, and from the perspective of attempting to publish articles and large pieces of literary criticism rather than creative writing. So articles are normally about 3,000 to 8,000 words generally, whereas monographs or academic books are usually many tens of thousands of words, if not many hundreds of thousand words in length. So I'll obviously be assuming that you do want to see your name in print or contribute to your field of academic study, given that you're attending this session today. It's also somewhat essential to be publishing if you're looking to get a job in academia or a related sector, and it can really help supplement your PhD studies or even your MRes studies or undergraduate. As a heads up, you can submit parts of your PhD for publication whilst you're working on your thesis, and this will allow you to gain feedback from top scholars working in your field, which can then feed back into your doctoral work, regardless of whether the piece achieves publication or not, ultimately. But just a bit of a disclaimer to start with, don't expect to make any money from publishing articles, and you'll only ever make a little from publishing academic books. It's not really that sort of game. A lot of prestige attached, obviously, but not so much money. So if you're looking to be an academic, there's an obvious need to build up a publications profile gradually. And when it comes to getting your first article published, I'd often been told that it was best to start with publishing book reviews. And this certainly isn't bad advice, as it can help you get your name recognised. But you should also understand that any respectable journal will have a double-blind peer review process in place, which typically means that the editors will give submissions a look over to make sure they roughly meet the quality standards of the journal, and then send it on to multiple peer reviewers who won't know who wrote the paper. And in return, you shouldn't ever be told who they were. So the double-blind element of the review, that's basically you don't know who they are, they don't know who you are. And the reviewers will provide detailed feedback on your submission, along with a recommendation to the editor as to whether or not the journal should publish it or not. And ultimately, what I'm trying to get at here is, if your article is well written and original enough, there's no reason that you will have to have previous publications, such as a book review, because the peer review process attempts to create a level playing field for everyone. So don't feel intimidated or that you can't submit an article by any means. However, what you must do, and I'll try and share my screen at this point, is you must avoid simultaneous submissions. Now, I'd never really understood why this was the case. However, I have actually found somebody who's done it, and it's not worked out well for them, essentially. So this is one paper about a film called Leviathan. This is another paper that's exactly the same, about a film called Leviathan in a completely different journal. So this is most journals will specify and say they don't want to accept simultaneous submissions, and you can't submit your work in two places at once, basically, is the idea. And that's because you can end up being published in two journals, and a lot of the times the journals won't even check with each other. So, it can happen that two completely separate journals will publish an article on Leviathan and think, oh yes, this is really good, we've done well to get this article, and then, etc. So you can get away with it, but it's not good practice, and you could even get embroiled in a copyright dispute, I imagine, if either journal or publisher finds out. So only submit your article to one publisher, and once you've submitted that piece, you can't then submit it elsewhere. So it's kind of like a version of Tinder or Bumble, where you can only message one match at a time. You have to wait back months on end for a response. It can obviously be intensely frustrating to have to wait for ages to hear back from a journal, but you have to kind of cultivate a remove from the submission after it's been sent off while you wait to hear back. Although you can, of course, submit multiple different articles at the same time, two different journals. There's nothing stopping you from doing that if you've got the work ethic. So something I kind of want to discuss as well is calls for papers versus ad hoc submissions. So for well-established journals, they often accept submissions all year round or for large periods of the year, and they'll normally not have many stipulations as to what topics they want authors to be writing on. However, I've always found that my work seems to stand a better chance when I submit to call for papers or CFPs, and the publication process is often shorter in these cases. it's important to realise that if a journal publishes a call for papers as well, they're actually like publicly committing themselves to completing that issue and within a specific time frame. So they'll take all submissions which fit with that theme seriously when they look at them. And book publishers can also have windows where they push for submissions in a particular field, and I'll mention this a bit later when I talk about my Doctor Who monograph contract. However, normally it's a topical subject which they think they can make a lot of money by commissioning monographs on if a book publisher does do this. So what I'm trying to get at here is submitting to call for papers can give you a really good chance of achieving publication, as long as your paper fits with the theme of the issue well. And if it doesn't, don't try and shoehorn it in, I'd suggest. So peer-reviewed papers are the industry standard for articles, yet there are some exceptions, particularly in the science fiction field. There are a few exceptions that I know of, and I'm sure there are exceptions in other fields as well. Some journals feel it impinges on creative freedoms, and it's kind of like censorship. So there may be some journals that don't do peer review that are still very strong journals. However, for those of us that are doing ref, obviously looking to work in academia or already in academia, we need to have it peer reviewed. So it's important to consider that. And journals which don't offer peer review normally aren't the sort of journals you should be associating with anyhow. Certainly some of them, it's always worth checking. If they're not offering peer review, then there's a good chance your academic work won't be rigorously edited into shape until it makes the best formulation of its argument. And that's a really important part of the publishing process. So it's just something to consider. Although, of course, if you really do want to see your name in print, just go for it with any journal. But there are some shadier ones than others. So generally, kind of following on from that, try and avoid direct requests by email to publish with a journal or book publisher. These are usually from predatory publishers, I find. Be critical and ask why they've chosen to email you if you do get an email from a publisher like this. Check their information pages closely. And huge point here, you should not ever have to pay a manuscript or article submission fee. And as a rule of thumb, publishers who charge you any fees whatsoever for publishing with them are generally best avoided. Of course, there are going to be exceptions, but normally this is a case of a predatory journal taking advantage of people. If you do follow up on any solicitations that you receive by email, it would be worth checking that they're familiar with your academic work. And of course, they should be if they contacted you themselves. So deciding where to publish. Take a serious and detailed look at the journal website or online catalogue in the case of a monograph. Does the publisher or journal look professional and like a venue where you'd like your work to appear? If you've not published before, submitting to postgraduate journals can be a really valuable way to get your feet on the ground, as their submissions processes are often designed to be far less intimidating, and there's obviously a lower bar for the level of writing which they look for that is catered to postgraduate students. And for the tutors here, thankfully, the current ref system, there's not as much prestige attached to achieving publication in high-ranking journals, as I'm sure we all know, especially compared to scientific fields. So we're quite safe in that way. We don't have to worry too much about, getting in the highest ranked journal. So something else to consider is, does the journal assign ISBNs or ISSNs to publications? This is another kind of industry standard sort of thing. If not, you might want to avoid publishing with them again, because it's an important factor in your publications being discoverable by others and indexed in databases, etc. But again, it's not necessary. And then when you're looking at journals, use Google search and Google Scholar search. See if any of their publications appear high up in the search results, which gives you a good indication of how visible your work will be if you publish with them. And then, are there any leading names in your fields on the journal's editorial or advisory boards? That's always a way of seeing whether a journal is the one you want to be going with. And then finally, in terms of assessing journals, there's a necessity of making a realistic appraisal of not only how well written and original your essay or book is, but also how well it fits the publisher's scope. So you can have a great article written, but if it doesn't fit with their implicit stances, often they don't always make these things explicit, then it's very unlikely to make it through the publication process. So the best way to get a feel for this is to look at the articles or books they've previously published and check that none of them published within the last decade or two outright clash with what you're trying to say, but also that they've got stuff published that kind of gels in a vague sense with what you're trying to say, if that makes sense. Don't go completely off from what they're publishing. Make sure they've got at least a few things in your sort of scope. So Journals are intensely focused on what they ask for, either in the call for papers or in the journal guideline pages. Although you can adapt a piece of writing you've already produced to fit the theme of a CFP, I'd actually encourage you to do this if you can, since it avoids wasting time working too long on a specifically tailored original submission, which they may reject outright. You also do need to be careful here. In particular, you'll need to ensure that your abstract in the introduction of the text address the topic rather explicitly, as whether or not it fits the brief is one of the first considerations an editor will make. And quite often they'll reject them if they can't immediately see how it fits into the theme of the issue. So something I've found over time, and a lot of this stuff I have learned gradually, is you've got to have a very tightly defined thesis for any article submission, including like streamlined terminology. So a good way of thinking about it is that any article you submission should have a clearly defined thesis which it succeeds in proving, and it should make as few deviations from that objective as possible. In the case of one of my articles, I attempted to publish a piece which looked at science fiction texts through the lens of posthumanism, for an example, in terms of their ecological credentials, and I faced a lot of opposition for my argument not being clear. Now, if reviewers say that your argument isn't clear, what I find they often mean is that your ideas are too complex to fit within a journal article, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of your research, but in terms of getting publication, it can be problematic. So ideally, looking back, I would have stood a better chance of getting published if I'd only talked about posthumanism implicitly here and just talked about science fiction and the environment. So it's obviously a bit different in the case of a monograph, as each chapter should make some kind of unique deviation from the book's central thesis, but still needs to be informed by it. So it's also about learning with experience what editors and reviewers like to see. Even if you get a few rejections, can help with this, and what they don't. So in my case, it often comes down to how you define posthumanism in terms of my research, and making sure that you do, because people have very different ideas about what the term means, and it's a very central term to anything that I'm publishing generally. So be prepared to define every specialised term you use in your papers or your book, as editors like to assume their readers will know nothing, and doing this helps to show that you as an author understand the field very well. I find that a good way of defining is making brief quotations from prominent sources in the field or adjacent fields, even if you then go on to dispute these definitions, just to get you started in the introduction, your critical framework, as it were. So if they've got a style guide, and they should, you need to follow it down to the letter, even though this is time consuming. And it will likely mean that you need to familiarise yourself with a handful of different referencing systems if you're submitting to different publications. So submissions can be rejected outright for failing to follow the publishing house or journal style guide, and adhering to it perfectly helps to make a good impression, and it means less work for the editors to do in the event that your submission is accepted. It's a way of getting on the good side quite early on. Generally, the more prestigious the journal, the longer you should expect to wait between the original submission and publication. Up to 2 years for the whole process isn't uncommon, and in the pandemic, things are often moving even slower, so expect it to be a glacially slow process, and you shouldn't be disappointed. Don't expect to be given a date of publication either with journal articles, I've found, and then even sometimes with monographs, the date you're given is often no guarantee whatsoever. Yeah, and then just a little bit about revisions as well. If you get past the original stage, you'll normally be told to revise it in some significant way. So these can be frustrating, because for each round of revisions, at least a few months are normally added on to the final publication date. I would always respond to all the peer reviewer criticisms and treat them as mandatory points to be addressed, even if you're providing a reason for why you're not addressing it. Most of the time, reviewers will never get to read your responses, but the journal editors certainly will, and it's a vital opportunity to prove your expertise in the subject area. And then peer reviewers aren't always right, and they can actually be very wrong indeed. They often read through fast, as it's an unpaid position, and they may have missed nuances in your arguments, or only got an overview of what you were trying to say. However, poorly thought out feedback still gives you good scope for improvement, as it allows you to bulletproof your arguments against readers who don't have the time to either ponder the argument you're making in detail, or those from other disciplines who read your work with little knowledge of the field. It's also really useful to understand that rejections are part of the course, and are experienced by even leading academics. They don't in any sense mean that you shouldn't work further on the submission. If it's rejected, you'll generally get some really valuable feedback as to why, and an indication from the editorial team indicating whether they'd be interested in a revised version. So yeah, then you can either send it back after revisions, or look to resubmit it elsewhere. So Yeah, and then kind of going on to Logopolis, I recently got a book contract, of course, yay, on Doctor Who. So just kind of using this as a bit of an example, really, and talking about some of the stages in the development of it. So there are numerous questions to ask yourself as you formulate the research, basically, for in this case. So there's the creative spark of finding something that you want to write about. In this case, this was the Doctor Who episode Logopolis, which is a fantastic episode of television. This is the Blu-ray release, which came out recently. So consider both. Is there an opportunity to write on it, and is it relevant? In this case, the serial had recently been remastered, especially for the Blu-ray box set. So it's certainly relevant. And as I luckily discovered, there's actually a series of critical reflections on Doctor Who episodes and serials called The Black Archive, which is published by the publisher of those books. I'll just share the web page now. Yes, this is the Black Archive website. So yeah, I found this and it seems like a perfect fit. So next, I was considering whether this was a good venue for my research. Considering that I already wanted to write a book about the serial, Black Archive series was a perfect match, but it's obviously a lot less clear of a fit than this. So then, do I have enough time to meet the submission deadline? So they've helpfully got a very clearly laid out submissions page, which tells you all the different submission windows. So I did have enough time, but barely, and only if I step back from writing my PhD thesis for a solid 2 months. Sorry, Will, as I hadn't written anything at the point that submissions were due in 3 months' time. So expect the writing process to take longer than your initial estimates and budget for this. So at this point, if you've decided to go for it, further practicalities become important. How many words are they asking for in the submission? And what are they asking for? Are they asking for anything else? So here they were asking for a detailed chapter breakdown. So note that the submissions guidance page also specifies that they commission very few books in the series out of the total submissions they receive for the Black Archive. So you're undoubtedly taking a big gamble in this instance. At the same time, though, they were certain to be commissioning one monograph from each specified time period of the show. So there was a definite possibility of being successful. So the next thing which I actually did was very politely and professionally but succinctly email the editors to inquire whether they'd be interested in reading a submission on Logopolis, because they've got lots of titles already commissioned. And this also allowed me to know whether they'd already got one that they on Logopolis or whether somebody else was interested there. So it's always a good practice with journal articles as well, when the submission isn't going to be a call for papers, to just email ahead and check whether what you're thinking of talking about kind of fits with what they've got planned, because it helps reduce the chance of an outright rejection, and it means that the editorial team may recognise your name when they receive the submission itself. Then, of course, it was time to write the thing, and it helped me to read a few previously published titles in the Black Archive range to get a good idea of what the writing style was like, and also to get a sense of the formatting used in the final version. And it uses quite strange formatting for this submission. They use a strange use of bold text. So this is all the chapter synopses. And yeah, here you had to provide a rundown of what the chapters look like. So the assumption here is that they hadn't been written yet. However, because I'd written the whole thing in advance of the submission, I was naturally able to give a very convincing précis, I hope, of each chapter. Yeah, and in terms of style guide, any advantage you can give yourself helps. I actually use this picture, which they use in the final published versions, which obviously I wasn't asked to provide, but it just kind of helps give it a bit of a thematic understanding. So whereas the sample is about 10,000, 15,000 words, the completed manuscript, which obviously will undergo revisions, is actually 30,000 words. So I had to cut it down a lot for the submission. And that's quite often the case with what they ask you to submit originally for monograph sort of stuff. So all that was left to do at this point was to submit both documents exactly as the submission guidelines specified, and then wait to hear back. And word count, again, is really important. I wouldn't go over word count, although they're normally not too funny if you do. And whether it's journal article or monograph submission, you should get a confirmation email back telling you that the publisher has received your submission. But after that, the wait can be excruciating. So in this instance, finally, it was, and thankfully, it was commissioned after a 3-month wait to hear an outcome. So not too long, really. And yeah, I don't know what I'd have done with the material otherwise in this case, because it's pretty specific. And it's due to come out in 2023. So in many ways, I'm still at the beginning of the publication process. So expect the editing stages to be very lengthy, with any submission that is even accepted. So just a few more things that I wanted to touch on then. If you're looking to submit journal articles, there's this website called Upend. If you Google Upend, it will come up. So it's a really valuable centralized resource when attempting to determine good venues for your articles, although it caters far less to opportunities for publishing monographs. It's got different subcategories for themes and can be searched for keywords. So if you're looking to publish something on the 18th century, there's all different calls for papers and journal and conference proceedings that are to do with the 18th century. So it can be searched with keywords as well. However, consider that many of the listings here will have deadlines which have already passed. It's often quite out of date, and slightly more than half the call for papers listed on the site of the conference papers, rather than publishing an article that you've already got ready. So just a few more points then. Particularly in the case of articles, it's always worth considering how accessible you want your work to be once it's published before you submit. So where this comes in is there is things called paywalls, which you've probably come across in your research anyhow. And for monographs and publications in high-ranking journals, it's often a given that your research outputs will be locked behind paywalls, unless you as an author are prepared to pay an extortionate fee, often thousands of pounds, to buy an open access license for them. So there's often a trade-off between making sure that people will easily be able to read your work and getting it published in a venue where it's going to be freely available to everyone. But in a journal where there's only a limited number of people will read it, so it's really kind of a balancing act to some extent. And perhaps depending on how good you think your article is, maybe aim for a higher journal. Yeah, and then of course, online presence once you're published. I've tended to always put mine on ResearchGate and academia.edu with profiles on there, and that seems to help them get found by other people. And of course, archive them in Chester Rep with anything that you publish, the university's reference database. And then check through any contract you've signed as to whether you can share the research publicly on these sites as well. But they do seem to massively boost the visibility of your articles. And then finally, consider taking out a membership of the ALCS, Author Copyright Licensing System, I think it is, which is for anything published in Britain to receive royalties from the UK-based academic publications. So they charge a one-off fee, but after that, there's a steady trickle of royalties twice a year. But again, don't expect much. I've had about enough to buy a couple of new CDs so far from that. But yeah, a way to get a little bit of money back from your publishing. And yeah, I think that's about my 20 minutes, isn't it, Alex? So thank you for listening, everyone. And I'll stop recording now.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I wish I'd had